Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very, very special addition to our neweveningisle.com podcast conversation series. Today, we will be discussing all about the life of a very, I don't know, very archetypal poet throughout history, yet very unuttered, by the name of John Bradburne, who was born on the 14th of June, 1921, who, after serving in the military, served as a lay member of the Third Order of St. Francis. And then, after being further convinced by poetry, he settled in the Mutemba in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and was tragically killed in 1979. But what makes his story rather extraordinary is he holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the most lines by a single person in all of the medium of poetry, with a surviving of at minimum 170,000 lines, almost doubling that of Shakespeare. So, the topic of this conversation: what drives a man to live only for poetry? We have a very wonderful guest with us, a wonderful linguist, world class Shakespearean scholar, co author of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language. We have David Crystal. So, David, thank you so much for giving up your day for this. We appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, John. Good to see you. Nice to be with you all.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I read your tribute on his poetry collection website, and of the excerpts that you shared, I really enjoyed this excerpt in particular because I feel this almost was like the most poetic autobiography of John Bradburne, and it's almost the theme of what we're talking about. And I'll share this excerpt with you that you shared. It goes, "Birds that spontaneously sing ask not reward or anything. Of man's appreciation, they being but gods, make songs each day, especially at morn and eve, in giving thanks, they thanks receive." So that I feel that that kind of summarizes it all as a whole. It's almost him recognizing the almost the almost pathological extent to which he was writing poetry.
Mm.
So, so yeah. And then the first thing we're going to go over is your involvement with the John Bradburne Memorial Society. So, what first stirred you towards John Bradburne's story, and what need did you feel answered in yourself when you became involved with the Memorial Society?
Yeah, well, it's one of those long train of coincidences, if there are such things as coincidences, of course. Um, I left the University of Reading, where I was professor of linguistic science for 20 years, because of cuts in the university world. This is the mid-1980s, and came back to my hometown. I'm speaking to you from my hometown of Holyhead. It's in North Wales. It's where you get the ferry if you're going to Dublin. And I needed a new job. I came up one Easter after thinking it's time to leave the full-time university world, and spoke to my uncle John, who lives down the road from where I'm living now. And he said, "David, go independent. You see, an independent scholar would be very useful in the world." And so I thought, no, 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 there are no such things as independent linguists. And he said, "Yes, you be one." So I thought, okay. Went outside, got in the car, drove up to, it's a cul-de-sac, drove up to the top of the road, turned round, and just opposite was a house. And it was a lovely house. And I looked at my wife, Hilary, and we said, "Do you know, we could live there if we did what John says." So we made an offer on the spot, got it accepted, went back down to Reading, sold our house, and then moved back up to Holyhead, where I've been ever since, writing, broadcasting, talking, and so on, as an independent linguist, really, but with a strong interest in literature as well. Now, what's the relevance of that? Turned out that the house we bought was owned by the parents of a guy I was in school with. His name was Kevin Jones, KC Jones, because of his initials, KC Jones. And I didn't know that at the time. But having bought it, one day Kevin comes around because it's his old family house, and he just wanted to see how it was these days. So he comes into our house, and he comes up to this very room I'm in now, and we have a chat. And then he pulls out of his pocket a letter and says, "Dave," he says, "have you ever seen anything like this?" And I look at it, and it's a verse letter from John Bradburne. I say, what's all this about? Well, apparently Casey was in Africa, in Rhodesia, some years before, fell ill, and ended up at the Salisbury, where the capital of Rhodesia at the time, Harare it is now, and was looked after by John Bradburne, who made him better. And then because they had a shared interest in music, Casey was a sort of itinerant musician, um, they started corresponding. Now, here's the thing about John Bradburne. He found prose boring. He hated prose. He wrote it from time to time in his travel diaries and so on. But no, poetry, he says at one point in an interview, is what I like to do. It helps me to see more clearly and memorably what I want to say. And he would write his letters in verse to his mother, to anybody, and to Casey. And so he shows me this poem, this verse letter. And I'd never seen anything like it in my life before. And I said then, the craziest thing I've ever said in my life, I said to him, is there any more like that? And he said, you want to just 175,000 more lines more. Yeah. He said, you need to get in touch with the John Bradburne Memorial Society, which had been set up by John Bradburne's niece in the 1990s. So I wrote to her and said, Celia, her name was Celia Brigstock, I've just seen this letter. Is there much more like this? A few weeks later, a suitcase arrived with the most part of 175,000 lines of poetry inside it. And if you had it on the floor, it would be up to, my nose here in terms of manuscripts and typescripts and things like this. And I suddenly realized that there was something very special going on here, because I'd never seen so much poetry before attached to one person.
An overstimulation of poetry.
Well, absolutely. I know my literature. I used to study it when I was an undergraduate, language and literature. I know how much people write. How do you measure poetry? Well, because it's in lines, the easiest way is to count the lines. And so you go through, and I did all this counting over the years, and I counted how many lines in Milton? Oh, about 20,000. How many in Wordsworth? 54,000. How many in Shakespeare? 87,000, or more or less. How many in John Bradburne? 175,000 plus. And that's an important point, plus. As I say, I'd never seen this before. And the John Bradburne Society, Celia said, well, David, have you got some time on your hands? Well, of course I had, because I just left my full-time world and I was a freelance now. And so I started to edit that oeuvre. Not by myself, you understand. I had help. Hilary, my wife, did some typing, and a couple of others helped as well. But no, this was, how do we publish it? Well, fortunately, another coincidence, along comes the internet, along comes Google, 1999, and all of these things. And so suddenly we realized that it's unpublishable as a single volume, all that amount of stuff. But online, of course, it's dead easy, or at least, relatively speaking. So it took about 10 years to crunch all this data into a website, which
How
is
many
now
years? How many years?
10,
10
more
years.
or less. Yeah, more or less. Not all the time every day, you understand, a little bit here, a little bit there. And the website went up in the early, where was it? I forget now, early 2000s, I suppose, maybe a bit later. www.johnbradburnepoems.com. And if you type that into Google, folks, don't forget the E on John Bradburne, otherwise you won't get anywhere.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Even when I was Googling him for research, I always got auto-corrected on that. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. Right. Yeah, that's hysterical. When you first found his poem and you asked if there's any more, that's like to me, that's like seeing 3.14 and then asking, does this number go on any longer? Like to pi? That's the thing for that. So
That's right. Well, you know, that I say 10 years, but you see, it's continued ever since, John, because that initial, well, actually, originally it was about 160,000 that arrived in that suitcase, and it's over 175,000 now. Why? Because people keep finding new poems. Because he wrote poetry to everybody, and he was a great correspondent. He loved to write all the time, and there are dozens and dozens of people who receive poems from him in these verse letter forms. And what do you do? You know, we're talking the 1970s now. What do you do when you get a letter of this kind? You read it, you think, oh, that's really cute. You write back, and maybe there's a few exchanges, and then you put the letter into a top drawer somewhere and forget about it. And then suddenly, 30, 40, 50 years later, you realize, especially when prompted through the media and through the Memorial Society, but actually that letter is a letter from a possible saint in the Roman Catholic tradition. And you think, hey, where was it? Where did I put that? Where did I put that? And over the years, over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, every few months, I get another poem from somebody somewhere. 2 or 3 years ago, somebody rooted around in a journalist's drawer in Zimbabwe and found 45 poems that we didn't know about. Just in January of this year, one of John Bradburne's friends, a doctor called Wayne Perry, who worked in the hospital there and got to know John, many correspondences with him, and he'd sent me, he thought, a typescript of all some years ago of all the poems that he had. And then this year he decided, I'm downsizing, I'll send all the manuscripts as well. So they all came through the post one day to me back in January. And I read through them and I thought, we've got that one, we've got that one. We haven't got that one. And suddenly I found a new poem, you see. So this is what's happening. And there are probably more out there that'll come in over the next few years. It's quite extraordinary. Never come across anything like it before. And I doubt anybody else has either.
Yeah. So it was as recently as January as this year that we keep finding it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if people want to know what are the new poems, say you had looked at this website 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and you'd seen all the poems that were there. Well, if you go to the section in the website called About the Poetry, down and scroll down, I've listed there all the new poems that have come in over the last few years. So you can find them easily.
Yeah. So when you think back to your earliest encounters with his oeuvre, his life and his work, what strikes you the most as worth preserving for the world at large?
Well, the first thing you have to realize is that we're dealing here with a rather extraordinary character who spent his life looking for a vocation. He was in the army, as you mentioned. He fought in the Second World War out in the Far East. He came back. He was reared as an Anglican. He converted to Catholicism in the 1940s. He had encountered all kinds of religious experiences previously, being in India, with Buddhism and Hinduism. He was fascinated by Judaism. He had all this mix of backgrounds, and he spent many years looking for a vocation. So he thought, I'll be a monk. So he went to one place and he tried it out, and it didn't work out. So he went to another, tried it out there. First he started with the Benedictines, and that didn't work out, and then the Carthusians, that didn't work out. And he went all over the place trying to find somewhere. He calls himself a vagabond, trying to find somewhere to settle. And he said he had 3 wishes in an interview with a priest sometime later. One, he said he wanted to become a something, not a priest necessarily, but he wanted to serve in some way.
Like a Cenobite almost, like a very austere practicing monk. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. He wanted to die a martyr if he could. And he wanted to be buried in his Franciscan habit, because at one point he became a third order Franciscan. That's a lay person who joins the order of Franciscan missionaries. And he had these three wishes: to serve lepers, that was the first one, to be martyred, and to be buried in his habit. And for a long time, that first wish didn't happen. And then when he realized that there was no future for him in Britain, he asked an old friend of his who was now working in Rhodesia whether he had a cave where he could come out and pray. And the guy said, yeah, come on out, come on out. And he went out and joined the missionary group out there. And at one point, one day, traveled over to this tiny little settlement 100 miles northeast of Harare, called Mutemwa, as you said, Mutemwa, Mutemwa, Mutemwa. And he found the leprosy settlement there, where the lepers were being treated like animals, crawling about on the floor amongst the dogs and cats and everything, licking. They weren't being looked after at all, licking their food off bowls if the dogs hadn't got there first, their sores untreated. He stood there for a while, looked at it and said, I'm not leaving here. I'm not leaving here. His friend who had brought him there said, look, John, you've got to come back to Harare and at least get organized before you do this. Well, he did, but he was back there a few weeks later and he stayed. This was 1960 something, late 60s. And he stayed until 1979. And he altered that place dramatically. The lepers loved him. He looked after them. He bathed their sores. He did everything for them. There were various incidents along the way which caused problems, but on the whole, he was the lepers' father, really, their father figure and their father really in everyday life. Now, the reason for telling this story, and we'll get on to the point about his death in a little while, is that he felt that poetry was a métier through which he could see life. One of your poets, Robert Penn Warren, says, if I remember rightly, the poem is not a thing we see. It is rather a light through which we may see, and what we see is life. And John Bradburne felt that dramatically. He felt that poetry is the main way in which you see things. And what he saw was a leprosy community. He saw God in that community. He looked around, he saw fauna and flora and landscape and saw the divine in those settings. He saw God everywhere. And he felt that his main task was to express that vision that he had about the combination of the natural and the supernatural, the everyday and the divine, to try and bring those two things together. And he felt that poetry was the best way to express this. He had always tampered with poetry, even when he was at school. But he started to write it really only when he came back after the war and began to write about his conversion and about his newfound experience of Catholicism and all the rest of it. And the poems sort of started to flow. I say in the website, it was like a tap, his poetry, and it was always on. He couldn't stop writing poetry. He would write everywhere and everything, every day, many poems. I told you he has 175,000 lines. That's about 5,000 poems. That is only a fraction of what he wrote. Because every now and again, over the years, he would look at the stuff he'd written and say, ah, it's rubbish, and burn it. And then he'd write some more. Fortunately, because he sent stuff to other people, it didn't get burnt, you see. But he was a perfectionist in that sense. He had a very strong feeling of what it meant to write poetry and to get it right in the way in which he wrote. We can talk about his technique in a little while.
Yeah.
So over the years, all these poems started to build up and build up and build up, but nothing like the frequency with which he wrote when he went to Rhodesia, because there he found a new source of inspiration, the lepers themselves. Never in the history of English literature has anybody ever written poems not just about leprosy, but to individual lepers. He writes a poem, a sonnet, to every one of those 80 lepers that he encountered in Mutemwa, an individual one, praising their uniqueness, their resilience, their character, their humor, their ability to defeat that disease. And he writes poems about the lepers, to the lepers, and at every spare moment in his caring day, he would go back to his hut and write poetry, manuscript to begin with, and then he got a typewriter, and Lord of mercy on us, the poems flowed after that because he loved his typewriter. And so in the end, we get these 5,000 poems, and stimulated by the different circumstances in which he found himself living.
There's a lot to unpack from that, honestly. First off, I'm very surprised to hear about his perfectionist tendencies. You'd think somebody that wrote that like I said, almost pathologically writes like that frequently. I really assume that would almost eliminate any aspiring writer or poet's sense of perfectionism. So to hear that he burned a lot of his poems was very, very surprising to hear. And I'm also I really like that what you said too, that you're kind of more admiring the man behind the poem rather than the actual body of work. And I remember I was listening to a interview with Henry Miller, the Tropic of Cancer, and he actually, I don't know if this is true or not, but because he actually noticed too, like people compared to people in the United States and for people in Europe, where people in the United States do tend to focus on the work itself, where the people in Europe tend to focus on the author, the writer, the man. And then once they make a bad work, that's kind of it. But that's not really the case here. So these are just like patterns that I've almost noticed. So with your lengthy involvement with the society, has that taught you anything personally about devotion or service or like impact that one person can have? Like, did it serve any like soft inspiration in that way?
Well, yes. I mean, we should talk a little bit about the themes that he addresses. Several very important themes. In his view, his main purpose in writing poetry was to make people see. To see what? Well, in his case, he felt that his primary task was to explicate the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, for those who aren't familiar with this doctrine in Christian terms, the Trinity is a view of the divine, of God, as having three persons, expressed as God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, or God the Holy Spirit. And these three persons are usually said to be, it's a mystery. How can this be? What is going on here? God the Father, the creator of all, God the Son in the person of Jesus, and God the Holy Spirit in the person of the flames of fire on the apostles, and all that sort of thing. John says that he has been told some divine inspiration here. Who told him? In his view, the Virgin Mary, Our Lady, with whom he had a very strong personal relationship, told him, you have to tell the world about this. And so some of his best poetry is an explication of the Trinity, looking for analogies to try and express what's going on. His most important analogy, he says, the Trinity is the thought, the word, and the voice. God the thought, the Father. God the Son, the Word. God the voice, the Holy Spirit working in everybody. These are three persons, he says at one point, of love, in love, with love, forevermore. He has other analogies: chooser, chosen, and choice. The chooser, the chosen, and the choice. Another one comes to mind: heat, light, and sound. He's continually probing and trying to get at this notion of the Trinity. And I think he succeeds, because when you read the poetry on the Trinity, you end up, I mean, not totally understanding it. I mean, who could?
Yeah, right.
But certainly getting a grasp on it in a way that you didn't had before. So that was one of his first big themes, the Trinitarian kind of idea. And then a second, to my mind, the second most important theme is his ecumenical interest. I told you he started off as an Anglican. He became a Catholic. He was fascinated by Judaism. Christ was a Jew, after all. The Old Testament is a Judaic tradition. He sometimes signs his poems as John Bradburne, Jew. He's proud to identify with that tradition. And yet he's a Jew that is just as interested in Islam. He's a character who, when he was on his travels, he would go into a mosque and pray, for instance, and writes a poem about it. When he was in India, he was fascinated by Buddhism and Hinduism. So those come into his poetry as well. Several of his poems have the Hindu mystical syllable, Om, and he puts Om Mani Padme Hum. He puts that into many of his poems. You read his poetry and you think, what religion is this guy? And the answer has to be, he's everything. That they may all be one, he writes, reflecting a New Testament saying. And by all one, he means all the religions of the world, not just, the various Christian denominations and so on. So he's a great ecumenist. And if he becomes a saint one day, we can talk about that later, I reckon he's going to be a saint for ecumenism as much as anything else. So that was the second big theme. What else? Well, he's a nature poet. I mean, we all know about nature poets, Wordsworth and all the others, they write poems about the birds and the bees and everything. So does John Bradburne. And he writes with a very sharp eye for detail, describing the plumage of birds or the behavioral habits of baboons and so on. You can see the point. He started off in Britain, where we've got a few birds and bees, yes, certainly, but crumbs. You then go to southern Africa, and what do you see? The most extraordinary range of fauna and flora. And he writes about everything. It's 1,000 poems written about various aspects of the natural world, which he sees as a reflection of the divine, you see. It's not just nature, it's God in nature. And so the nature poems, I think, are some of his best, actually. And you don't have to be a religious believer at all to get value out of those nature poems. And then the fourth thing, and I've alluded to it already, if I had to sum up John Bradburne in one word, I would say he was essentially a human poet, in that he represents in his poetry all aspects of the human condition. And I mean all aspects. Whatever the mood he's in, he writes a poem about it. If he doesn't feel well, he writes a poem about it. If he doesn't like what he's eating, he writes a poem about it. Here's one for you, John. If he's feeling constipated, he writes a poem about it. Now, never in the history of English literature, I don't think, though correct me if I'm wrong, folks, has anybody written a poem about constipation? Well, certainly Wordsworth didn't, anyway. See what I mean? He writes about everything and that's what endeared him to me more than anything else. I could identify with this guy. I've been constipated. Yeah, so haven't you? We all have. and his likes and his dislikes. Which coffee does he like? Which tea does he like? What pudding does he like? It's all in there at some point or another. You can identify with a guy like that. And if he does become a saint one day, which other saint has told us all about their likes and dislikes in that kind of way, in so many different ways, and with such technically brilliant verse? We get onto that in a minute, perhaps. So, yes. These are some of the themes that strike me more than anything else.
It's very, very funny that you say, trying to sum him up in one word, because I actually already had mine in mind before you said it. To me, the number one, I guess, adjective to describe him would probably be insatiable, probably. Yeah. And learning about this, I sense an almost Leonardo da Vinci like curiosity, like an almost extreme curiosity. But that also doesn't make sense too, because Leonardo, to our current knowledge, only left behind about 25 to 30 works. He didn't leave a whole skyscraper full of paintings, just like a suitcase full of poems. So
Yeah.
so now so now on to his kind of shift in the military. So how do you understand Bradburne's shift from the structure of military life into this uh, very visual, very free realm of poetry and contemplation? And the two-part question is, did you learning about him sense any conflicts between the two, especially afterwards?
Yeah. No, I didn't sense that. And the reason is he hardly ever refers to it. Like most people who have been through a war, and the Second World War in particular, my folks, my wife's folks, and so on, they never talked about their experience. You know, it was over, and we don't want to go back there. John was the same, I think. He does refer occasionally to it in an indirect way because, and the military link is important because of his friendship with John Dove, Father John Dove, who became a Jesuit, who is the man who invited him out to Rhodesia in the first place. They met during the war and spent a lot of time talking to each other about life, the universe, religion, everything, and so on. He talks a lot about that, and then comes back, leaves it behind, really. He was lucky to come back because, of course, one aspect of his story that you can read up in the biographies that have been written about him, two or three biographies, one by John Dove, another by a French writer, Didier Rance, R-A-N-C-E, Didier Rance. And they tell the whole story about his military experience and how he had to escape from the Japanese invasion, suffered cerebral malaria, evidently had a vision during that period, a divine vision, a vision of Our Lady, amongst other things. So there was that kind of discovery of himself that came out of the military experience that he never forgot. But the actual structuring of the military time doesn't really manifest itself very much, except, I guess, he had a very strict regime in his day. He writes a diary about his day in Mutemwa, and it's very specific, 7:30, 7:45, 8 o'clock, 8:45, and all the things that he did in the course of his day. So he ends up as I say, as a vagabond, as somebody who was looking for a, a special kind of life, found it, and then decided to write about it. But the other thing that impresses me so much about him, John, is not so much the semantics of it, the themes, the meaning of what he was writing. It's the technical brilliance of it, and this may have something to do with his earlier life. You've been encountering poets all over the place. The 20th century poetic experience is free verse, isn't it? You
Yes,
write as freely as possible.
basically
Uh,
Finnegan's Wake.
yeah,
Yeah,
blank verse, no rhyme, no meter, no nothing.
yeah.
You just get it out there, but put it in lines and express it as vividly as you can. A reaction against the period in English literature when rhyme and meter and so on were the predominant poetic form. He goes back to that. His entire poetic work is rhyming, metrically regular, traditional forms like the sonnet or the ballad, and it's technically ingenious. Best way I can express this, I suppose, or illustrate this, is to take just a couple of lines from one of his things and point out some of the features of it. What's this one, for instance? When he was in Mutemwa, he wrote a poem, as I mentioned, to every leper. One of the lepers was called Timu, T-I-M-U. And this guy had lost his leg because of the disease. He could only get around by shuffling around on his bottom. And he reared chickens and eggs, as it were, as his contribution to the settlement. So John writes a poem to Timu. He wrote several, actually. He wrote a sonnet. Here are the opening 4 lines. I'm going to read them quite slowly.
Go ahead.
Timu is no Timon. Ah, no, that's it. Timon of Athens, of course, Shakespeare. Timu is no Timon. Athens were to him inseparable word from hens at hand. Many a time I greet him daily, Tim, ever is bright, dimness to him is banned. So what have we got here? 4 lines, metrically regular, tim, ti-tum, 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 ti-tum. 2 rhymings at the end, him and Tim, hand and band. A literary allusion, Timon of Athens in the first line, and then a pun, a bit of wordplay, because hens, Athens, hens is in there. A little bit of alliteration, a little bit of assonance, but what none of you will have noticed, and you wouldn't notice hearing it in audio terms, but only when you read it, is that it's an acrostic.
Yes.
Timon begins with T. Inseparable begins with I. M begins the word many. E begins ever. It's time written down. And when you look at the whole sonnet of 14 lines, the acrostics read, time I went to bed. It's a joke. And this is the thing about John Bradburne. He jokes, he puns, he says, God laughs all the time. And his wordplay is everywhere. This is what endears me to him, perhaps even more than what I mentioned earlier. The fact that he's a punster par excellence. Nobody makes puns. Ogden Nash did better, I think. Yes, and there are a few like that. But this guy, he puns all over the place and has wordplay of all different sorts. So sometimes you just burst out laughing at some of the lines that he writes. So here's a task for you guys out there. You've thought of something you want to write a poem about. A sonnet, shall we say, 14 lines. Okay, write it now. Make sure your lines are metrical. Make sure they rhyme and have an acrostic at the beginning all the way down. Go ahead. I've tried it. It's virtually impossible, or at least not without 50 versions. Here's the other magic.
Constant iterations.
I mean, you try it out. No, that's I'll try it out again, especially on on Word or something. You can correct it and correct it and correct it. Now, here's the most magical thing of all, John. He never corrected a version that he wrote.
It was always the first draft.
It was always the first draft. There's just the occasional sporadic word change here and there. But you see it in manuscript. He writes it out and writes it out and writes it out. And there's no corrections. And that meter and that rhyme and sometimes the acrostic, not all the poems are acrostic, just some of them, of course. The wordplay, all the allusions, and the thought behind them are all written spontaneously. It's magical. Or it's inspired, or it's something.
That's almost computational, almost.
It's just amazing, really. And the thing about it is, and by the way, you can see this for yourselves, folks, because if you go to the johnbradburne.com website, we spent a very unhappy period scanning every one of these poems. And put the scans, well, I didn't do it mainly, Hillary did, and put the scans up on the website. So when you go to a poem, you can read the transcribed text. And then if you want to see the original, you click on the little icon at the top and the original will come up. You will be very impressed at the nature of the writing, the elegant hand that he has, and the fact that it just flows out of him, line after line after line. What? With all these rhymes and everything, and getting all the meter right? How does he do it? This is the extraordinary thing.
Yeah, and then to like prove your point, to like give you assurance of like your appreciation of his wordplay, that's actually not gone unnoticed in even the most brilliant artistic minds. I can think of at least two people that have made that point. Namely, a friend of mine named Christian Book from Canada, uh, a modern. His main contribution was he embedded a poem into a DNA protein that can outlast the sun, but that's not beside the point. But he said something one time to where he noticed how all of the greatest practitioners of any medium, they tend to take the seriousness out of the medium, like John Cage with performing silence,
Yeah.
or with James Joyce. To me, like I could be wrong on this, but to me, the seminal part of the literature equivalent would be James Joyce, especially with Finnegan's Wake. David Lynch with film. So
Mm.
that's just a reassurance and I'm glad you've noticed it too, that many of the greatest practitioners of art, paradoxically almost, they do take the seriousness out of it. They bring a very childlike playfulness to it.
Yeah. And self-effacing in the case of John. He's the first to be self-critical. Uh, when people think of an oeuvre like this, 175,000 lines, they say, it can't all be good, can it? And the answer is, no, of course it can't. It goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. Who says it's ridiculous? John does himself. He says some of my stuff is just doggerel. And indeed, some of it is. Some of the lines are just, oh, come on, John, you could do better than that. He would say himself, no, that's a lousy poem. And he'd burn it, you see. That's the thing, except we've got a number that he didn't burn. So we know. But at the other end of the scale, and each person that reads him will be the judge of this. You will find something that is sublime, that reaches out to you, that you feel, speaks to you in a certain way, that you just admire because of the technical brilliance or whatever it is. There'll be something there. I mean, of course, one of the problems is that with such a huge amount of work, where do you start?
Yes.
Well, on the website, I've made some suggestions. And over the years, I've done a few anthologies for the John Bradburne Memorial Society. John Bradburne, Birds, Bees and Beasts, for instance, have selected a number of poems about fauna and flora, Songs of the Vagabond, and another one called John Bradburne on Love. And then if you're really serious and you want to go into it in a bit more detail, you can have a look at this book, which I did a few years ago. Can you see it okay, John?
Yes. Yep. I can see your name. Yep.
Yeah, it's a book I wrote on John's poetry. It's called A Life Made of Words, The Poetry and Thought of John Bradburne. There he is with his headband on and his Franciscan habit down below, and an airmail letter, because he would write on airmail letters all the time. He'd just fill a letter. Here's another extraordinary thing. You know what an airmail letter is like? It's that big. Starts there, finishes there. So he starts to write a poem at the top of the airmail letter and finishes it at the bottom of the airmail letter.
Intentionally.
On the actual letter itself.
Mm-hmm.
And when you forget that and type it up as an entry in a database, you think, what a lovely poem. And you say, why? And yet it was constrained by the size of the paper. And in fact, the vast majority of his poems were written to fill a page of paper. Was so rare out there, so difficult to get hold of. This is one of his problems. How can I write poetry when there's no paper around? And he would write on anything. He would write on envelopes, on bits of magazines. He would write inside a book on the front cover. He'd write anywhere. And the thing is, you'll see it in some of the pictures some of the scans. You got an A4 sheet. He starts to write a poem. It's, say, a sonnet. So it goes down to halfway down the A4 sheet. And he thinks, oh, I've got half a page left here now. So he writes another poem. And that fills up 3/4 of the A4 sheet. And that leaves just that much left. So I could do a 4-line poem in there. So he writes a 4-line poem,
Two poems on the same paper.
all on the same page. You'll see that
I've never,
over.
I've seen a lot in my life, like in my poetry. I've seen a lot of experimental poetry. I've never heard of that.
No,
I've never heard of someone taking a small piece of paper and writing two poems on the same paper. I've
yeah,
never,
or four in 3 or 4
yeah, yeah.
in some
I've
cases.
never heard of that.
Me neither. Me neither. I mean, it's just so fortunate that so many of these poems have survived. Um, it's because he sent them out to everybody. He really wanted to be read. He wants people to see what he's talking about. These themes you remember about the Trinity and so on. And people did keep the poetry, and he did pack a number of the typed poems into cases and kept them around and so on. So we're lucky to have that many. But remember, I told you an awful lot we have lost forever.
Was so that book you showed us, was that the one? Because after doing my research, was that the one you published in 2018, right?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
that's right.
Yeah,
That's
right.
right. That's right. Yeah, people kept asking me, you've edited all these poems. Um, uh, you're the closest anybody's got to understanding what they're about because nobody else had read them all. Nobody, had read them all. Even John Dove says he hadn't read them all. Uh, and so that book seemed to be a good way of trying to express the essence of what it's all about. And of course, at the time, um, John was totally unrecognized as a as a human being, as a poet, certainly. I mean, who knew? Had you ever heard of John Bradburne before? No, nobody had. Just these few people around. And then slowly, thanks to the uh, spiritual developments that took place after his death, his public persona became more evident. So we must just briefly talk about that. Um, Remember his 3 wishes: serve lepers, die a martyr, buried in his Franciscan habit. Serve lepers, done that. It was the civil war in Rhodesia at the time, and the various factions were causing, the usual sorts of problems that you get in a civil war. His little settlement was away from the center of activity, but nonetheless, there were various groups of guerrillas, freedom fighters, whatever you call them, around in the area. And there was a lot of deaths, a lot of murders, a lot of assassinations, and so on. He was advised several times to get out. He refused. He was not going to leave his lepers. That's the important point. Despite the fact that he was in great danger, as a white man, after all, remember, in a Rhodesia that was wanting to get away from colonialism and introduce a new society, which of course it was successful in doing eventually. He was told, get out, John, get out. He would not. He would not. And then one day he was abducted by local people, really, who didn't like him much because he kept all the lepers. He was looking after them. He kept their cattle. He was looking after their lands. The local people wanted those lands, and there was a lot of controversy between him and local villagers. Anyway, whoever it was took him away. And a couple of days later, he was again advised, get out, John, go to Mozambique, you'll be safe there. He refused. He wanted to go back to his lepers. So they shot him. And then the things started to happen. His body at the side of the road, the witnesses at the time said they wanted to get rid of the body because if the military came along, they'd all be held responsible for killing a white man. So they went to remove the body. They saw 3 beams of light coming from somewhere onto the body. It scared them to death. They left. They came back later. They saw a large white bird hovering over the body. It scared them. They left and didn't come back. The body was found, taken to Harare, to Salisbury, for a funeral, which happened a few days later. The funeral mass is perhaps the most intriguing thing that happened that launched the subsequent events that we can talk about. During the mass, the coffin is at the top of the aisle, like you do in a funeral service. His body had been prepared for burial by the local undertaker. One of the people in the congregation noticed that 3 drops of blood had fallen to the floor underneath the coffin. Several people saw it. What? The undertaker was, to coin a phrase, mortified. This is unprofessional. They took the body and the coffin to the sacristy of the cathedral, opened it up, no sign of any blood. The body was perfectly dry. But somebody noticed that he was not wearing his Franciscan habit. They sent for one, they dressed him in it, reburied the body. Away he goes. His 3rd wish, remember, I want to be buried in my Franciscan habit. And then the things started to happen. People immediately felt, here we have a saint in the making. And if you know the sainthood tradition in the Catholic Church and in some other places too, you need to have special events of one kind and another, miracles in due course, people praying to the saint for intercession from God for a cure or for something to happen, and testimonies start to come in from all over the place. Right from the very beginning, people felt that they had lost a saint. People would say, have you ever met a saint? I have, John Bradburne. And they would start coming to Mutemwa. All right, fast forward now 50 years. This year at Mutemwa, on the anniversary of his death on September the 5th, I'm not sure how many thousands of pilgrims came, tens of thousands. They come all year round. Mutemwa has become a place of pilgrimage, a local Lourdes, if you like, for Salisbury, for Zimbabwe. The hierarchy in Zimbabwe have reacted to this over the years, and 2 or 3 years ago, they launched the cause for his sainthood, his canonization. Now, of course, you have to know that that doesn't happen just like that. There are 3 stages that you go through, 3 or 4 stages, actually. If you're going to become a saint one day, John, you or me or anybody, you've got to go through 4 stages. First of all, your life has become so impressive that you are called a servant of God. That's stage 1. Stage 2, you might be called venerable. If, after exploring, you think, yeah, this guy really is something. Stage 3 is beatification. You're beatified. You're called blessed. Stage 4 is you become a saint. You're canonized. Saint John Bradburne, it would be. In order for these stages to take place, various things have to happen, including, of course, some miraculous events of one kind and another. By miracle here, I mean absolutely tested, cast iron. Somebody was written off by the medical profession, prays to John Bradburne, and a cure immediately happens or soon after. That sort of thing. There are a couple of examples of that already in train, but
So it has to be empirical almost.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And gosh, you don't just nod and say, oh, thank you very much. The whole thing is scrutinized by dozens of people in Rome, doctors, lawyers, the lot, to make sure there's no con taking place here. And it's all inexplicable by any other means. It takes time. Sometimes somebody doesn't become a saint for a century or more. We've just seen this with John Henry Newman, who became a saint just recently after 100 years or so. Well, I hope it won't take that long for John. But anyway, in Zimbabwe, the hierarchy has already designated, authorized his cause for beatification to go forward to Rome. That has taken place. He is already designated a servant of God. And so that process is underway. And the, as it were, the justification is not because it's not top down. It's not sort of a number of priests and bishops saying, "Oh, let's have a saint here." It's bottom up. It's the thousands and thousands of people who go to Mutemwa as a pilgrimage site and feel renewed, uplifted as a result of doing that. I've been to Mutemwa, and back in the 90s, when we were first researching this whole thing with Hillary. And it is indeed a very, very special place. The lepers, of course, are still there. Not just leprosy now, but some other diseases as well, like AIDS and things like that, but mainly lepers. And the John Bradburne Memorial Society was set up not in the first instance to make John a saint. That's a sort of side issue, really. No, to keep Mutemwa going, to raise funds for Mutemwa. And they have raised thousands and thousands and thousands over the years. That place needs every bit of help it can get from anybody, all over the world. And the funds sort of roll in. There could always be more, because as you know, that part of Africa suffers from drought and all the other things. It's not a very well-off part of the world. And they need every bit of help they can get. So the JBMS, the John Bradburne Memorial Society, was set up primarily to help Mutemwa and to keep John Bradburne's legacy going. And then, oh, well, let's make him a saint at the same time, as it were. That came as a secondary string, which is now, of course, well, slowly coming to the boil. I don't know when it'll be, but the postulator for sainthood, the person appointed to look after a cause, is called a postulator, and he has been interviewing everybody and getting all the data together. All these poems have got to be read by 3 theologians to check that they're okay. He doesn't say anything heretical in relation to Catholic belief and things like this. It takes ages, but it's all ongoing at the moment. Very exciting. And as a result, the news is out there. From a time when John Bradburne was not known at all, to a time when the society exists, the poetry website exists, gets many hits every day. Oh, and incidentally, on the poetry website, there are recordings of John reading his own poetry, which you can listen to. He reads in a very sort of very, very elegant British sort of way. He's very, very, very sort of careful poetry reader as well. And suddenly he's known. And heck, why are we talking to each other? The news is out there and it's growing.
Well, so is part of the reason his canonization is taking so long is because the theologians, do they have to look over every poem he's ever written that's been discovered?
Absolutely everything, yes. And also everything that's been written about him. And that's grown as well, you see. I mean, 10 years ago, there was nothing to read, apart from John Drugg's little diary account of him. And now we have this very large biography by Didier Rance that I mentioned, and a number of other booklets and books and things like this published by the society. So there's stuff to read now, and people are understanding more and more about it. Well, the guys who look after these causes, they have to read absolutely everything. But it looks very promising because, as I say, the first steps in that direction have already taken place. So before too long, the news will break, and woof, the interest will go through the roof. And then what I hope is that people will find some more poems.
Yeah. So it's amazing. You're answering so many questions with just one question, which is wonderful. So I guess to sum up the next few questions, I'm just going to kind of combine them into one. So what did John Bradburne believe poetry was used for, especially in regards to because and I don't mean this politically, I mean this existentially. You know, this is a wild time for anyone to be living in, especially young people. Did what tool did he believe poetry used for, you know, people that were clearly suffering? And obviously, I don't even think on a global scale you could get worse than the leper colony in Rhodesia. So, what was kind of his tool with poetry in that regard?
What was his what? So I missed that last bit.
What did John Bradburne believe poetry was a tool for, like in that
Oh
regard,
yeah,
like
yeah,
all the people that are in such dire situations? So
yeah. Well, you remember I mentioned at the very beginning of our chat, what Warren's comment about poetry is there to make you see, and what you see is life. Well, if you wanted to know what it was like to be a leper, how would you find out? Um, it's not easy. I mean, Hansen's disease, yes, and you could read up all the medical literature, but you don't get a feeling of what it's like.
no,
Here's a guy telling you what it's like through the eyes of the lepers that he writes about. And some of his descriptions are pretty vivid, I have to say. I mean, he's not scared of saying this guy's got a suppurating leg and all, you know, all the things. Um, and he talks about how how they need the sort of help that they need. And for him, the lepers are, first of all, of course, in their own right, individuals that represent a way of life that is in its own way divine in some you know, hidden respects, or recognition of the divine in some hidden respects. But for John, and certainly for people who have been reading the poetry since, those lepers are a symbol of the poor, the marginalized, the the worst parts of society that need the help of outsiders more than anybody else. I mean, today is World Day of Prayer for the Poor, coincidentally, that we're talking to each other. And if John were here now, he would say that, yes, the lepers are one thing, but they represent a segment of mankind that goes well beyond that leprosy settlement in Mutemwa. And I think people see this. And I've now been to many readings and given, in the days when I used to travel around and give courses, I gave courses on John's poetry to people. And the people who go to these courses go there not actually because they're interested in the lepers at all, really, but they take that leprosy oeuvre and apply it to their own circumstances and say, well, I've not got a leper that I'm looking after, but I do have this guy who's got whatever, you know, multiple sclerosis or whatever it might be. And the issues of care and need that these guys have are exactly the same as what John talks about, because the message that comes shining through is a message of hope. We are in the Catholic tradition coming to the end of the Jubilee year of hope, as set up by Pope Francis a year or so ago. And hope is the thing that shines through an awful lot of this. The fact that these lepers, having been looked after in the way John did, can now start to laugh and play and joke and be proud of themselves is one of the most moving experiences that comes through the leprosy poems that John wrote. And then you immediately translate that into the wider world.
what did you say? What day it was? Like some coincidence of what day it is today? What was that?
The World Day of the Poor.
Oh wow, wow,
The
that's
World Day of the Poor.
incredible.
Every day has got a day of some sort or another, hasn't it? And
Yes,
this one has been called the World Day of the Poor. I mean, what? Uh,
yeah,
to
it's
try and focus attention on need, really.
and in terms of his like his hard technique, like his actual writing style, did his time with in the leper colony shape any of that? Was that any different, or did that mostly remain intact?
Well, it did in a curious way. When you read some of his longer poems, any literary critic would say they don't hang together thematically. He might start off talking about, God the Father, shall we say. And then in the next verse, he talks about apples. And you think, what? And then in the next verse, he's back on God the Father. And then in the next verse, he's talking about wheelbarrows. What? What probably happened was this. He's in his little hut, typing away. He starts to write a poem about God the Father. He gets through the first verse, and then he's called to help some leper in the village who needs help. So he goes out there, and the leper wants an apple or something like that. So he gets him one. And then he goes back into the hut. And now he carries on with the poem. But now the poem is about the apples that he's just been talking about, dealing with outside. So the next verse is all about that. And then, oh, he's been called out again. Off he goes. This toing and froing of subject matter, which seems to have been stimulated by his circumstances. That's one of the most endearing features of some of these long poems. As a literary poem, doesn't work very well at all. Some literary critics would say, "Oh, my dear chap, it's not coherent." Well, no, it's in the very incoherence he is representing the society in which he was working. That, I think, is the strongest link between the two.
That's amazing. It's because it's funny how I like how you brought up when you were teaching these courses and seminars, people were attaching they were attaching their own suffering to his subject matter when he was working and caring for the lepers, and especially with a very likely very big recrudescence, very big revival of his work once he becomes canonized or a saint. Do you believe that it could still be his work could still be relevant in the future into it's very specific, like people looking at his poems as a mirror for their own questions about life and how to deal with it? You think that'll like kind of go on an upward trend as time goes on?
Well, I think so. Well, I hope so. But certainly it's happened so far because, to take an example, he was writing in the 1970s. This was a time when there was civil war, as I mentioned. It was a time when communism was considered to be one of the greatest threats to various walks of life. So he writes a lot about local politics, national politics, and international politics as well. So there are certain aspects which are dated in that respect and don't travel well into the 21st century, although some of the general points about political issues do travel. However, remember I mentioned before the reference to Shakespeare in Timon of Athens.
Yes.
Well,
Timon.
he knew his Shakespeare backwards, did John. He knew all sorts of writers backwards. He makes literary allusions all over the place. You get references to Wordsworth, to Tennyson, to Byron, to all sorts of people. He has a musical bent. You remember that link with Casey Jones at the beginning? He was in organ, he played the organ, he played his recorder. In the period when he was wandering around Europe, he would take his recorder and play in the streets to earn some money to get some food. He was a great musician in that respect. And he ties in a lot of his writing with the great composers of the past. Bach was his favorite. He had many others, and they're all in there somewhere, either explicitly named or, and this is a clever one, he takes a theme from a composer, the rhythm of the theme, and writes a poem reflecting the rhythm of the theme. The great fugue that Bach wrote, I forget its exact title, dun, 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 that one, excuse the lousy rendition.
Yeah.
But you know, tum, 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 and the poem writes like that. word, 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 and he writes the whole poem reflecting the musical rhythm of the original. Now, all these things. Oh, and I mustn't, of course, forget the Bible. He knows his Bible backwards as well, and an awful lot of the allusions in the poetry only make sense if you know your Bible well also. Otherwise, it's going to go over your head. You know, references to some of the Old Testament prophets, for instance, references to the sorts of things that Jesus said. They just sort of dropped in here and there. And okay, you can read the poem and miss the point, or you can read the poem and get the point. So, one of the things I did when I was editing the poetry was sometimes draw attention to the illusion that was hidden within a particular line. But gosh, there are all kinds of literary perspectives that could be drawn out of this poetry, which I hope people will do. Not me. I mean, I hope people with a biblical background, people with a strongly literary critical background, would be able to add dimensions to this kind of writing that I could never do. If you want to see the originals, by the way, John, I haven't mentioned this. I used to have them all here in this very room as I was going through them, but they're all gone now. Where have they gone? They've gone to the Institute of Catholic Studies up at Durham University, up in the northeast of England. It's the main academic centre for Catholic studies. And they have an archive there in a strong room, and all the originals are in that archive now. And that's where you'd go if you wanted to actually see the originals and feel them and do the things you like to do with original manuscripts. But otherwise, you've got the website, and I hope there will be other websites that will emerge in due course, exploring some of these other potential universal themes, which is the main link. You asked the question, the main link between how things were in the 1970s and how things are today. Some things don't change much. Fauna and flora and landscapes don't change that much. The concern for the environment doesn't change that much. Oh gosh, here's a thing. If there's one thing that unites everybody these days, whatever your religious background or your non-religious background, surely it has to be the environment and the care for the planet and all of that. He was one of the first, John Bradburne. The word ecology hadn't been invented in the 1950s. It comes into use in the 1970s, ecological and the like. John was one of the first people to write ecological poems. What's one of the things that a lot of people say? Oh, we must cut down on the danger, look at the oceans. Plastics. Right, okay. So if you don't like plastics, you write a poem about them, do you? He wrote a poem about the dangers of plastics in the 1970s. Probably the first person to ever do so. He wrote poems about deforestation in the 1970s, themes that are dominant now. And he was there at the beginning. So I think that's another theme that goes through that has actually become bigger and bigger and bigger as time has gone by. And if you're looking for antecedents for the present concern, you'll find some in John's writing.
So he was, from everything I'm taking away, he was nowhere near as unidimensional as one might appear to me for someone who's pretty much spent their whole time writing poetry, with his influences from music and influences from, faraway lands. And it's funny that you say that he had very extensive knowledge on Shakespeare, and I know anyone who knows your work knows you do too. Is that related in any way, or is that just like a very funny coincidence that you discovered in his writing?
You can't avoid it. He had his views about Shakespeare too at the very beginning of his writing career. he was a Baconian. Yeah, he actually thought, nobody could write all that wonderful stuff. It has to be somebody else, like so many people believe these days. And
Mhm.
he thought it was Bacon, which was one of the big contenders. I mean, there are over 50 people that people have suggested wrote Shakespeare, rather than Shakespeare. It's a big, become a thing. But he started off thinking, no, Bacon did the right, and then he changed his mind. He thought, no, Shakespeare did, and this goes back to his school days. I think he was in plays, in Shakespeare plays in school, and he actually did a little bit of acting himself. And then later, when he was in Rhodesia, he would do the occasional reading and things like that. So, the Shakespeare is there. It's not dominant, but it's a theme that you just turns up every now and again. I mean, who would expect Shakespeare to turn up in a poem about a leper, for instance? You see, Timu, he's no Timon of Athens. Okay. And you think, what's the link there? Well, if you know the story of Timon of Athens, you realize that actually there are parallels. Timon is a rich man who gets treated so badly by his friends, he goes off into the wilderness and sets himself up as a hermit. What? And suddenly you begin to think, hey, there are parallels here, which probably John had in his mind, but he leaves it up to us to try and work out what the parallels are, which is I think some of the best kinds of literature, where the writer doesn't tell you everything and makes you work it out for yourself. You mentioned James Joyce at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Well, he's a perfect example of that.
Yeah, there is a that's actually like a established thing. I don't know if I'm sure you've heard of it, the iceberg theory.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, by Ernest Hemingway. It's
yeah,
purposely leaving things unsaid for you to figure them out. Um, so yeah, wow. Hmm. Wow.
yeah. But he wrote about everything, John. I mean, he really did. As I said, from the Trinity to constipation. I mean, what can be wider than that?
Yeah, and
That's why that's why I call him a quintessentially human poet.
yeah, a human poet, and I think of him as rather. I just think of him as insatiable. I actually do. I find myself surprised even saying this. Because I do see so many links between him and Leonardo da Vinci, which to me shouldn't go together at all. Because Leonardo da Vinci was a polymath. He was very multidimensional, almost omnidimensional, actually. If I'm going to use wordplay, whereas this is a man who spent his entire life for poetry, but then you realize there's so much overlap. These are both people that I'm saying this because I like the illusion that it kind of creates if you dedicate your entire work to one medium. This
Mm,
was someone who was not happy with their work sometimes and burned it. Um, Somebody who was obsessed with seeing things too, and that's something I'm learning right now as I'm reading some John Ruskin. As the only thing more important than knowing how to think is knowing how to see. And
mm.
of course, with John Bradburne's approach is that poetry is the ultimate avenue towards that.
But
Um,
your allusion there just a few seconds ago reminds me of something else. The one thing John Bradburne was not was an academic. And in fact, he's pretty critical about people who leave the real world behind, as it were, and go off into an ivory tower and start to think about all sorts of things. He has a few critical things to make uh, about academics. I'm not sure he'd approve of me at all.
yeah, yeah, that's almost that. It's like that's almost like that. Yeah, that French inspired kind of
Mm.
uh, intellectual. I forgot his name, the philosopher, the one that refused the Nobel Prize, Jean something, Jean Strat, I think. Uh, my French is still in its infancy. So
Oh,
yeah,
mentioning French, that's the other thing you have to appreciate with John Bradburne. He writes fragments in French and in Latin. He was a bit of a polyglot because of the way he traveled around all over the place. He lived in Belgium in a French-speaking convent a monastery for the best part of a year. And, his French was very, very good. His Latin was good as well. And every now and then you'll see little fragments of these two languages, which as an editor I had to translate because I'm not sure how many people do French and Latin these days around the world. But that's another aspect of him.
Yeah, and you said your favorite part was, this was going into a time where the avant-garde was really taking off, especially in literature, and he was almost like a classicist in that regard. He was kind of going back to the more visually oriented poetry, and that's the other thing to point out is that even talking to you, I've never really heard of such multi-dimensional poems before. A poem that's both an acrostic and a perfect rhyme, and that features an almost board game amount of wordplay involved. So,
and done so fluently and
on the first try.
I mean, when I was talking about his fluency before, not correcting anything, you might say to yourself, "Oh, well, I suppose if you spent enough time on it, you could do that." But here's the thing: there are a couple of poems, just a handful, where he actually writes the time when he started writing the poem, especially during the middle of the night. Because if he couldn't sleep, he'd get up. What do you and I do in the middle of the night if you can't sleep? Oh, I don't know. But he writes a poem, you see, because he can't sleep. So he says it's 3 o'clock or 4 minutes past 3, or something like that. He writes this poem, which might be whatever length it is. And then at the end, he writes, and now it's 3:14 or something of that kind.
He would timestamp poetry.
Yeah. So the poem, we know how long it took him to write the poem. And this is another aspect. I mean, how can one explain this? He himself explains it by saying that his inspiration is Our Lady. I didn't mention this earlier, I hinted at it. He has this very special devotion to Our Lady. In fact, to the extent that he entered into a mystical marriage with Our Lady. Now, this sounds like a very weird thing, but if you know your medieval literature, you will know that priests and nuns at that time entered into mystical marriages. People would talk about the Bride of Christ, for example.
Yes, and Bride of Messiah.
Yeah, and the other way around too. You could enter into a mystical marriage with Mary. And when he was in Italy, at one point, he actually does this. He goes up onto the top of a mountain where there's a chapel and vows, as it were, marriage vows to her. Celibacy from now on, all the things that you'd expect. Comes back down and then says in various places, she now tells me what to write. She now instructs me how to pray. I do not know what to make of this personally, but I cannot explain some of the things that we've been talking about without some notion of divine inspiration. I must say, I just can't explain it otherwise.
I feel that same way about Bach's music. Because Bach, his music being so mathematically, the ratios are so perfect, but at the same time, he doesn't sacrifice emotional intensity. Yeah, I feel that exact same way. It's so perfect that it does challenge you almost. To your very core spiritually. And then really the last question I have is, because it's funny asking you this, because there actually might be some incongruence. What do you hope, because like I said, there's a very high chance he might explode in relevance due to the possibility of being canonized. What do you hope him and his work to be remembered for? And what do you expect it to be remembered for? Because I think with a person like this, there actually might be an incongruence between the two. So I think that's an interesting question.
Yes, it is, isn't it? Well, I hope. I mean, I think the answer to this will depend upon what sort of person you are, your own background. You want him to speak to you. Well, I'm Catholic and have that belief set that coincides with John. So therefore, my hope is that uh, his theological insights, his insights into the Trinity, into the liturgy, into the Bible, into all the things that I personally believe in also, will become um, a kind of legacy, a spiritual legacy, that he'll become routine as a reference. I go to church, I hear sermons, homilies, and these priests and others, uh, they're doing their best to elucidate something. Very often I'm sitting there and thinking, if you only knew about John Bradburne, that would help you expressing what it is you want to say. But they don't. They don't know about John Bradburne. So that's what I'm hoping, that there will be an increasing awareness that he has something to say to you about most things you want to talk about in a homily or anywhere else for that matter. My expectation is that that won't happen until not just the canonization side of things, but an awful lot of other writing gets done. I mentioned just briefly a few minutes ago, we need a literary critic to explore some aspects of the literary dynamic that's here. There hasn't been one yet. We need a theologian to explore some aspects of a biblical scholars person to explore some of the biblical side of things. That has been a Franciscan interest. So his Franciscan spirituality has been explored in a couple of books because he was a lay Franciscan. Oh, by the way, that's another little detail. He's a layman. This was a point made by the bishops in Zimbabwe when they fostered his cause for beatification. One of the bishops there gave a sermon and said, "What we need John Bradburne as a saint because he's a layman." And when you think about it, virtually all these saints that have been made have been either priests or monks or nuns or, religious generally. Ordinary lay people don't get made saints. And the bishop said that, this is an indication. It's often said, we're all saints in the making if we only choose to live a life that's good, etc., etc. But who do we look up to? Which other lay people have been already blessed in this way? And the bishop said, well, John Bradburne could be an iconic symbol for the potential of any lay person to do so much good in the world that from the point of view of whatever aspect of society you belong to or believe in, or people say you are special for that reason. And in the context of Catholic Christianity, you're a candidate for sainthood. So, who knows?
And so thank you so much for doing this. I learned way more than I was even expecting. I was already expecting to learn a lot. So if you could just give the audience so that we can support your work around this, what are where can we find some of your websites, and where can we purchase your book?
Well, I live online at www.davidcrystal.com, and that's where you'll find a bit about me, a bit about, well, all my publications, all the books I've written and things like that. They're all listed there. Bit of bio and the usual stuff you put on the website, and some links to some of the more specialized websites that I'm involved in. There's one on Shakespeare that I do with my son Ben called shakespeareswords.com. There's one on original pronunciation, which is trying to reconstruct the pronunciation of Shakespeare's time, called originalpronunciation.com. There's a lectionary site, audio readings by me of the entire year of biblical readings in the Catholic Mass tradition, and a couple of other things I forget about. But that's me. For John Bradburne, it's www.johnbradburnepoems.com. Don't forget the E. And that's really the only site, apart from the John Bradburne Memorial Society itself, which is jbms.com. You'll find that there. And if you go to those two places, each has a literature attached to it. All the books that I've been mentioning, and many I haven't mentioned, are in the shop on the John Bradburne Memorial Society webpage. And that'll keep you going till tomorrow, John. So, plenty there.
That's awesome. Maybe for the next 5 years or so. All right. All right. So yeah, I learned so much about this, and this has been absolutely a privilege. Learned way more than I was expecting. And he just told you all the ways you could support his work, which I will start doing. And David Crystal, I can't thank you enough for giving up your day for this. This has been absolutely wonderful, very engaging.
Well, John, it's an absolute delight. I mean, I'm thrilled that you're interested, and that people, thanks to your excellent podcasts, will also be interested. I mean, that's what it's all about, really. And I'm just grateful to you for the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you very much. Mhm.